Overall, the Baker report came with a dose of public relations polish, a veneer of criticism that, while it may have appeared savage, was still largely acceptable to BP. After all, what company can't improve safety? What chief executive would argue against embracing practices that will set a new industry standard? In Washington, Carolyn Merritt, the head of the CSB, knew that the Baker Commission hadn't gone far enough. BP had acted on her recommendation that it appoint an independent panel, but it had also largely controlled the scope of the investigation, and she feared that the limitations were deliberate. BP's upper management seemed to be walling itself off from the crisis that was growing within the company. Something was very wrong, not just at Texas City, but in the corporation itself, she would later say. It goes back to the culture of the corporation that was driving for maximum profits over everything else. The CSB released the results of its own investigation 2 months later. This time there was no BP press conference, no video link to Brown's office, no one on one interviews with BP executives, no promises to accept the findings. In fact, Brown later admitted that he never even read the report. The CSB called a public hearing in Texas City that drew about 200 people, many of whom submitted public comments. In its 300-page report, the 200-page appendix of key documents, without three-ring binders or glossy paper, was the most exhaustive the agency had ever undertaken, and its findings were far more stinging than anything Baker's group had uncovered. The combination of cost-cutting production pressures and failure to invest caused a progressive deterioration of safety at the refinery, Merritt declared. The key difference in the findings of the two investigations was the role that cost-cutting played in the Texas City tragedy. The CSB found that Brown's mandate to cut 25% across the board in 1999 and again in 2004, coming after Amoco's cuts earlier in the decade, had directly contributed to the accident, and that the cuts were made even as BP's own internal surveys were revealing increasing safety concerns at the refinery. Now, see, in here it goes on to talk about a training budget. Then it goes on to talk about safety and maintenance and layoffs. Then it goes on to talk about this one here. The refinery had an accident in 1994 when Amoco still owned it that presaged the 2005 disaster. Well, that's 11 years. Yeah, right? What are we learning this year about the difference between 10 years and 11 years? OSHA had criticized the use of blow-down drums and a vent stack for more than a decade before the explosion. Oh! Let me ask you a question. How many people had to file for workers' comp? Pause. This is a different book. ExxonMobil Chemical, headquartered in Houston, made up the third of the corporation's major divisions alongside upstream oil and gas exploration and production and downstream refining and fuels marketing, the gasoline station companies. In 2007, the chemical division accounted for about 10% of ExxonMobil's record $40.6 billion in profit. Upstream dwarfed chemical, and the latter's executives often labored in the shadows of their oil brethren. Yet if ExxonMobil Chemical had been a standalone corporation that year, it would have been among the 50 most profitable companies in the United States. Going on. Since the 1970s, ExxonMobil Chemical and its brethren in the industry's principal U.S. lobbying arm, the American Chemistry Council, had won more regulatory battles in America than in Europe. As with climate change, chemical industry lobbyists feared and fought the migration of European regulatory philosophies across the Atlantic. And after 2000, the regulatory issues that mattered most to ExxonMobil increasingly drew the corporation into a war of ideas about risk. Pause. 2000. 2000 would have been the legislative session during which the state of Texas was in the course of implementing changes to the Texas Insurance Code that had been on the books since the 50s. Significant changes to the Texas Insurance Code. Let's continue. Some scientists and scholars advocated a risk analysis model to evaluate the dangers of chemicals. This relied on mathematical calculations about the probability that a certain use of chemicals might hurt people. The chemical industry favored this approach because it effectively placed the burden of scientific proof on those who wanted to stop a chemical sale. even where scientists might establish some risk to human health. That measure of risk could then be weighed against the benefits of the product. Pause. Well, if you're using derivatives and you're misrepresenting who the actual product is, you might run into a problem. Like a $1 trillion derivatives market problem, right? Unpause. ExxonMobil and other opponents of greenhouse gas regulation had used risk analysis frameworks to strengthen their arguments in opposition to the Kyoto Protocol's goals. The corporation's allies in academia demanded that environmentalists prove cause and effect in climate change, science beyond a reasonable doubt. And even then, after 2006, when ExxonMobil finally conceded that human activity might be contributing to global warming, the corporation still resisted specific restrictions on carbon use on the grounds that the economic costs outweighed the environmental benefits. Dot, dot, dot. Here we go. After 2000, a new idea arrived from Europe to challenge the assumptions of the risk analysis school, the precautionary principle. The idea can be traced to West German environmental regulations enacted during the 1970s on the basis of Vorsorge, or precaution. Advocates of the precautionary principle argued that in cases where damage to society or people might be severe and irreversible, preventative action should be taken up front, even if there were important uncertainties about the relevant science. Dot, dot, dot. There was one more here that I thought might be a very important factor in addressing this. Okay, this is called the DINP. This was DINP. It's right up here, which is manufacturers of DINP. In 1998, public interest health groups filed a petition at the Consumer Product Safety Commission demanding that it ban DINP in children's toys and issue a national advisory about the threat to child health. The commission opened a review. Its staff scientists concluded initially that regulation of phthalates was worthy of additional future consideration because of the way DINP seemed to act on human development, but that more studies were needed. The commission next convened a study known in Washington speak as a CHAP, Chronic Hazard Advisory Panel. The panel acknowledged concerns about the genetic or reproductive effects of massive DINP exposure, but concluded that the actual exposure children might experience was so low as to be of negligible risk. Dot, dot, dot. Pause. Oh, right here. First shot. I mean, are you going to try to say that you have some sort of proprietary model where you've just been toxing me since I was a little girl? And so when I'm actually resonating with the kind of precision I needed, where my intent actually finds it in the book, that's on you. There's nothing spiritual about it, right? It's all about your amazing engineering. And that's what justified you completely defrauding everybody and mischaracterizing and misrepresenting the situation, even with an understanding that the pipeline risk management modality already had several experts, including those in Texas. And what I've been hearing the whole time is somebody make a bullshit excuse about how, well, there's no budget. There's no budget. No. I've already seen the way it breaks down. There's always a budget. It's about certain people making certain priorities. Like this one. Carroll waged a rearguard battle in Baghdad against the Bush administration's more radical privatization advocates. He made clear that he would resign rather than participate in a precipitous sell-off of Iraq's oil assets, according to one career intelligence analyst who worked with him at the time. October of 2013. Where was Rex Tillerson? February of 2014. Why the fuck was I in the Ukraine? Was there a decision to allow some sort of derivatives market scheme associated with those deals Exxon was hooking up in Iraq at the time to be a part of a precipitous sell off of Ukrainian assets. And my poor, badly re engineered ass would rather resign than co conspire? Yeah! See, just so you know, that is not eligible for any sort of insurance, like unemployment insurance, like workers' comp insurance. You understand, right? How many workers' compensation claims have been filed in the state of Texas since February of 2017 connected to explosions or leaks or some alleged accident at a petrochem facility or a gas and oil facility in the state of Texas alone before you swapped all that crime out last year to the Ukraine? It's a very simple fucking question.